little bit about designing architectures with UI Router. How many people have used UI Router ever? How many people do any sort of routing in Angular? Okay, so it's about the same number. That's cool. Good for you guys. All right, so I'm just going to do an introduction of myself. You may know me from the internet through one of these fine projects. If you use any of my PHP stuff, I apologize. Also, I work at a company where we do consulting and such. So if you need help with any of this stuff and you want to give me your money, you can give me a call. I like to start out by saying thank you, whereas most people like to end by saying thank you, because I think it's kind of amazing that I get to do this, and I don't know, like I've met all kinds of amazing people through open source, and I get to travel to different places and talk to fine people like you, and it's a pretty amazing thing. I couldn't really think of a better way to spend my time. Also, I have this interesting thought occasionally where it's like, if I was born something like 300 or 400 years ago, I'd probably be a peasant in working in a field or something like that, and I'm not. So it's a pretty amazing time to be alive. Just kind of reflect on that occasionally. All right, so we're gonna get through the philosophy in a minute here. This is just a few life lessons that I've learned being in open source. One of them is to be humble. I'm not like always great at it, but I've found out it's super important. Also, this is one I've gotten real comfortable with lately. Like when you're the author of a project, people kind of expect you to know stuff, and even at that level, like it's cool if you don't. So if you're like thinking about getting involved in open source or have some code that you're afraid that you want to release but you're afraid people are going to laugh at, just fucking do it. You'll be fine. It's fine. Also, like programming is, it's about 50 years, 60 years old, and we're kind of gotten to this place where we feel like we know what we're doing, but compared to like real professions that have been around for a while, like architecture or prostitution or something, we have no idea what we're doing. Like those are the oldest professions that I could think of, but we actually have no idea what we're doing. So that kind of is a corollary to the whole like feeling stupid thing. Another one is this. How many people have seen the movie Dogma? Okay, for the other half of you, I highly recommend it. So basically the idea is like it's a lot better to have good ideas than it is to have beliefs. I feel like there are a lot of things that we sort of take for granted that are like entrenched beliefs that maybe would do well with questioning from time to time. So that's really apropos of nothing. I just like to talk about that stuff because I have a podium and a microphone and you don't. All right, so for the actual talk, it's going to be basically about three things. I talk about hypermedia a lot, and that as kind of a way of interacting with an application service. Most of the software that I write, it's not really full stack. It's like you write an API, that's your back end, and then you write like a single page application that talks to it and does transactions with it in some way. So we're going to look at the negotiation of that a little bit. We're going to take a look at UI Router's internal architecture and how everything shakes out there, and then how you actually design an application to take advantage of this stuff. And then I'm told we'll basically have story time. And then karaoke, so stick around. So just a little bit of background on like the context in which we're solving these kinds of problems is where we've evolved to a point where the user interface, what used to be like the user interface in a full stack application, is now like an application in its own right, which is why we have this concept called single page applications. That's really cool. But then we also have this thing in the back end called hypermedia, which is like the cool kids version of REST, which is REST plus a couple extra constraints, one of which is that all of the knowledge about your data structures that you're interacting with are encoded in what's called the content type. So your application that is consuming it needs no like special out-of-band knowledge. And also, it's a state machine. So the idea with hypermedia is that you get back data structures, and those data structures have links embedded that allow you to traverse to other data structures. So you don't have to like hard code all of the routes for your server-side API in your client. You can just traverse using named links. So, but it's a state machine. But UI Router has a state machine. So it's like dueling state machines. But the separation, because it's a single page application, is resource state, is sort of like stateless resources that you're traversing versus client state. So whereas normally, like the browser would kind of be the keeper of state in like a full stack application, and the state is just the page that you're browsing. Now all the state is encoded in this state machine that you're designing on the client side. So you're kind of going a level up from the browser, which is why a lot of times like we have to reinvent a lot of the things that the browser gives us for free, like cookies and history tracking, because now the state is stored in your single page application in your state tree. So that brings us to UI Router. And so UI Router has states. That's kind of like the central element of abstraction. Specifically, it has nested states, so you build out this state tree of different states that you can traverse. And along with that, it has nested views and hierarchical routing and animated transitions and much, much more. So what about NGRoute? This is no longer true. Now with NGNewRouter, you have nesting, but, and we're going to get into this a little bit, we kind of like went back and forth with the Angular team in their design documents about like, well, you know, guys, we think states are a really good idea, and they're like, well, we think states are going to be kind of hard to get people's heads around, and I'm like, yeah, but no, because it's the central abstraction. Like, you need this. So instead, they kind of kept with their same model of like, you just define a bunch of routes and you pair those up with views. And it's a bad abstraction, in my opinion, but whatever, it's cool. So this is how the different components of UI Router work. There's Angular's old familiar location service. That syncs up with a URL router service that holds a bunch of URL matchers that you define. And then that syncs up with a state machine. And the state machine, as you traverse different states, it lets you import like different data asynchronously with resolves, just like core NGRoute. And that pushes down to the view manager, which pulls in templates from the template factory and populates your views. So pretty straightforward stuff. By the way, if anybody has any questions on anything, feel free to shoot up your hand and interrupt me anytime. Yes?
Will you be making your slides available?
Yes, the slides actually already are available on my GitHub, and I will be posting the updates for this version of the talk probably in the next day or two. So for the sample application that ships with UI Router, this is what the state tree looks like. We've got an implicit root state, which always exists. You don't have to define it. It's just there. And then you've got all these blue ones that are basically like normal states that you can navigate to by name. So like this one will be, you know, contacts.list. The contact state is yellow, indicating that it is an abstract state. Abstract states work basically like abstract classes. You define them, and child states can inherit from them, but you can navigate to them directly. Finally, edit is a state without a URL. It just pops up like a modal thing. So you can navigate to it, but it doesn't have a URL. That gets to be a little bit tricky because, like with history, there's no push state for it. We're actually working on a thing right now that's going to hook into push state. So you can make states for, or you can make history entries for things that don't have URLs. So raise your hand if you have ever wanted that. 2 guys. All right.
I have a question.
Yes.
Why wouldn't you want to have a URL?
Well, because if you're describing like a really rich state tree, so the question was, why wouldn't you want it to have a URL? Basically, if you're describing a rich state tree where you have a complex UI and you're trying to decompose every part of the UI into a state, that would be a lot of URLs. And so you don't always want a URL for every single state that you have, especially if it's just like, if you're just changing the mode of something, like let's say you have a detail view and then actually in the sample application, you hit edit and it flips over to like an editable form. So you're not really going somewhere else in the UI, but you still might want to be able to navigate back. So there's a really hacky history service that I threw up on Plunker that will sort of manage that, but it doesn't track. It doesn't correctly track like doing back and forth stuff. So if you hit back and then try and go forward with the browser buttons, it'll break. But it's just like a really simple proof of concept. We'll probably roll that into like a future version of UI Router Extras, which is like this ancillary library for UI Router that just has a bunch of extra stuff like that. So anyway, oh, this doesn't show up at all. Let's do something else. So this is the, oh, you're not gonna, fine. Let's do this, okay. Ah, too big. This is difficult. Okay, can you guys see that? That's sort of legible, right? No, kind of. Okay. Oh yeah, that's a good idea. Right. Render is a little janky, but that's fine. So this is, internally, this is what a transition looks like when you call state.go. So first it checks that the target exists. If not, state not found. If it's the same state but different parameters, we now have this concept of dynamic parameters that allow you to have, it's basically, you guys know attr.observe, $observe for directives. That allows you to like watch for changes in attribute or directive attributes. We basically have the same thing now for state parameters, and I'll show you a little bit later how you can use that for magicalness. So it kicks off state change start, and if you don't do anything to, or if you do something to prevent state change start, like return false or prevent default, it's gonna kick back a transition prevented. It's going to resolve all new states, so it's going to fire off all your resolves for each one of your states, try and get your data. If that breaks, then it's a state change error. If it doesn't, then it exits all the old states, enters all the new states, and finally updates the URL and any other globals. Yes?
What do you mean by exit?
So, okay, when you have, like, let's say you're going from B.C to like A.B, you have to exit those like B.C and B states.
It's like unregistered.
Well, okay, so for every state, you can define like exit hooks and stuff like that. So like it fires your exit hooks, and forget what else it does. I think that's probably it. I think it just fires your exit hooks. Oh yeah, and then I don't know if it was the case before, but it is now. Like exit hooks can return false to prevent the transition. So it's like if you have like data that's unsaved or something like that, you can be like, oh no, it can't exit yet. So yeah, does that answer your question? Okay, cool. Did you have a question? Oh, okay. Alrighty. So. Okay, so basic state definition, nothing special. Yeah, so here's these guys. We got OnEnter and OnExit, and so then when you're entering the state, it's going to try and load any dynamic data, and then you can inject that into OnEnter or into a controller or whatever. So how do we actually apply these things to application design? This is basically just my workflow. Like, you mock up an interface, slice it into views, figure out how those views are going to map into your different states that the user can possibly be in. And finally, this is a new one, map parameters to domain objects. So slice up your views, all great. This is a slightly more complex example, right? Not only do you have this state parameter that's sort of complex, you have to parse it with a crazy regex, but everybody's used Google Maps where you like drag the thing around and the URL updates in real time. Like, that's pretty fancy, right? So we did two things that make that possible now. First of all, so instead of having like a crazy regular expression to parse this guy, you still have a crazy regular expression, but you can now give it a name. So you can have a thing called location, and it's of type location. And that gives you this decomposed parameter value that's basically defined like this. So you can say URL match your factory provider, yay, Java names. And you can have a type called location, and you can either define that as an object or as like a factory function. So you can like define it as a function that gets stuff injected. And then types have a number of different functions and properties. The two main ones are encode and decode. So decode is, well, first of all, we have our pattern, which is basically like whatever regular expression is going to match that crazy thing. So then for decode, you can just take the pattern, use it to parse out the values, and return like an actual object instead of just having like a stupid scalar value for all of your parameters. So what's great here is that like you can take that string could be a user ID, and you could like return a promise for a user from the server. So like, how many people like use resolves all over the place for that? And it's like you have to do the same resolve all over the fucking place, and it's super annoying. Yeah, so this is basically like a way to encapsulate that. So it's like you define a type of thing in one place, and then in your URLs, wherever you want, you can say, okay, I have a value and it's of this type, and all of that marshalling and demarshalling of data is encapsulated. So you can have a thing that knows how to return things of that type, and then you have another thing that knows how to generate a string for a URL for that type of thing. So for a user or whatever database or like API object, maybe you're just returning an ID, or you could return something friendlier like a slug or whatever. So this is basically a way of encapsulating all that repetitive code and basically just having like a less bullshit way of handling that. Did somebody in the back have a question? No? Okay, awesome. So is everybody super psyched about this? See a few nodding heads, that's cool. And then the other thing that we rolled out recently, it's still on master, hasn't made it into a release yet, although I promise to fix that soonly, is this thing called dynamic parameters. So you have your parameter as a type, and it can also be dynamic. And what that means is that you can do something like this. So like, say you inject your state parameters, and then you got your location object, and then you can assign that to your scope, and then, oh man. All right, okay, I remember what I did here. I didn't do the view code, but it's fine, you can just imagine it in your mind. So let's say you have a Google Maps directive or whatever that you bind the attributes to a location. So as you're dragging around the map, the location object is having updates pushed to it. By making the location parameter dynamic, when you bind to this, state parameter is going to watch it. So anytime that value changes, it's automatically going to be pushing changes to the URL. So you get like Google Maps style magicness literally just by doing that. So it's awesome and amazing. So yeah, pretty exciting stuff. Yeah, so the other thing that we're rolling out, yeah, so I should probably back up for a second. We recently rewrote most of the internals of UI Router, and by recently I mean like 6 months ago, and then never released it in an actual version. So I'm finally getting off my ass and doing that now. Anyway, so this is one of the other things. One of the patterns that we see a lot is in giant switch blocks or similar a bunch of if-else's inside state change start or state change success to say if this state, if you're coming from this state, you're going to this state, then do this thing. We fixed that for you. So now there's this other thing called transition provider, and you can say transition provider.on.success.error, and then you can have match patterns in the same style as state.includes. So whatever state.star or .star star to match all the children. You can say from, and you can say to, and whenever that happens, run a thing. So here it's do a security check. If it passes, return true. Otherwise, we have this other thing called transition. That's basically instead of having an event like state change start and having 5 billion parameters, now they're all encapsulated in one thing called $transition $, which is a transition object that has your to, your from, your parameters, and all this other shit about the state that you would ever want to know. And the other fun thing you can do is you can say, oh, I want to return a redirect that's to go to another state. So it's you no longer have to do this out of band by importing the state service into your root scope or whatever to have the event hook and then call state. You can just return a redirect, and you can return that from a promise. So you can this can be a promise, and then you can .then it and return a redirect. You basically have all these new opportunities for hooking into the pipeline for state operations. And I'm just going to really quickly. Oh, that's big. Okay, so yeah, we have all these new things. So we've got. Oh, that's not it. Transition. So transition provider. Entering and exiting, and then in the callback, you get 2 special values. You get transition, like I was just talking about, and then you get state, which is the actual state object that's either being entered or exited. So you get that for every single state that's being entered or exited, based on that match object that takes includes style, glob patterns. So it's basically way more flexible. And the API for those transition objects looks like this. You can ask it for the array of all of the states that are being entered or exited. You can ask the state that it's coming from. You can ask if it's ignored. You can ask if it's equivalent to another transition, so on, so on, so on. If the current transition is the result of another transition that got redirected, you can trace that back. And you can also redirect it to a different transition, all kinds of good stuff. And also, states themselves have gotten an overhaul. So we have actual real state objects that live inside your state tree now, and those have an API as well, so you can get their fully qualified name and all kinds of other good stuff about them. So it's basically a whole bunch better. So yeah, that's what you get. You're welcome. Pro tip, we completely retooled the internals of UI Router. So when you do a transition, everything is fully atomic, and there's no more updating of globals or any nasty shit like that. The only thing is that this works except if you fuck around with your root scope or anything like that in enter and exit hooks. Don't do that. pronunciation really gets to me. Any questions? Yes, in the back.
Yes, the team at work is trying for a while to build a Angular web app. It's made up of a lot of different modules all interacting together. And we want them to communicate with this using the web app. The problem we encountered was that if we had UI Router in a single module, and it's like it had no way of accessing other modules' states, basically. Like there was no single state object for all modules to access operating. And we actually ended up rewriting or writing our own module to do that. I was wondering if it's possible to do something like this.
Okay, so the question is basically, you have a whole bunch of modules. They're not necessarily coordinated centrally, and they all have their own states that they define. Is that about right?
Yeah, so they all have their own states that they define, but we want the main application to be able to act as one application.
Yeah.
So we want a single.
Then have I got a deal for you? This isn't, so this is kind of still in progress. It'll land in the alpha for 1.0 by probably in the next couple of weeks. It's basically the ability to have like an actual traversable, manipulable state tree. So you can say like you'll be able to call $state as a function and actually get like a root node of your state tree and like be able to attach other states to it and like walk it. So if you, I assume you have like a main module, right?
So there's one main module that just loads all the other modules. And so like every single functionality is in each one.
Okay, and all these other modules have like their own state trees that they register?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, they'll still be able to do that, and as long as you're using some kind of like namespacing for your names of your states, yeah, you'll be able to like actually dive in and like move things around. So if like you have a module that's attaching a bunch of states, as long as there's like a root state for that module, you can like take it and move it somewhere else.
Okay. Would I be able to access another module's state?
Yeah, because it's all one state tree. And we're working on a way to like be able to have a separate set of states for like a particular module that then you could like shunt off somewhere or then like reattach at a different point. So that's basically what I'm talking about. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Awesome. Yes.
What was the reasoning in the newest version of UI Router? There was a change made that when you went to the page, it automatically scrolled to where you were on the last one. You had set like auto scroll true to set it to load to the top.
Okay, so in the latest version, we made a change where it automatically scrolls to whatever point you were at previously. Yeah, so this kind of went back and forth a little bit. Apparently, scrolling is like a really controversial issue. Who would have thought? Yeah, I'm trying to remember the reason for that. Basically, it's like we were trying to do whatever surprised the user the least, and like a lot of times people found it, especially for particular use cases, people found it really jarring to always like scroll back to the top. But now, like, the service is completely arbitrary. So like there's like a couple of default options, but then you could just totally like roll your own thing. So yeah, I mean, there are a bunch of different options out of the box. The default is the one that just seemed the least bad. Yeah, I don't know.
Because it gets complicated when you have like a fixed header. Now it's not the top or where you were.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I don't know. It's for like really complex apps, and especially like the apps that we were working on at the time that like that change got rolled in. Like it just didn't make sense to scroll back to the top, and I think that was the sentiment that was expressed by most people. You can absolutely still do it. It's just like a flag. There's another guy in the back here. Yes. Yeah.
The ability to add sections to the node tree, is that going to be possible to do asynchronously also?
Yes, it will be possible to do that anytime. So not just through state provider. Like you'll be able to register things through $state. I mean, there's never any reason that that wasn't possible. It was more like, okay, conceptually, can anything weird happen here where we're going to totally fuck ourselves later on? It was more like that. Yes?
Why would you want to use OnEnter instead of ng or just having init in your controller?
Well, first of all, okay, so the question was, why'd you use OnEnter instead of like ng init or whatever? First of all, you should never use ng init ever. Trying to think. Yeah, I mean, OnEnter is more for like initialization of stuff that's specifically related to the state. And so like one use case is like security checks or stuff like that, where it's like if you're not supposed to be able to enter the state, it's like you can bail from there. So that's one thing. Yeah, it's really just stuff where because like, I mean, for one thing, you can have a bunch of different controllers associated with a single state. So if there's something that's not explicitly related to, you know, any one of those controllers, it goes in the states OnEnter.
But if you define like an inline controller.
If you define an inline controller.
Well, like the next piece or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, like there's perfectly valid use cases, you know, to go either way. Generally, like the kind of stuff I do is like checking that, you know, the state can be entered, or like doing basic initialization, like stuff that, like generally, and this is just how I write, like my controller blocks are usually like, you know, one giant angular.extend scope, comma, big object block of things going on the scope, and that's it.
So just because I would have thought that it would be more suitable in the resolve to check like authorization.
Yeah, I mean, and you can inject your resolves into your OnEnter too. So, like, I don't know. I try and keep all that stuff separated out so that resolves are like just doing any, you know, loading and massaging of data that I need for somewhere else. So yeah, it's kind of a stylistic choice, I guess. Any other questions? Yes.
Resolving before the children, or like if like a child loads before the parent, how the order in which the data.
So what is the question is basically like what's the order of resolves if you have them defined hierarchically? That's basically right. Okay. That is an excellent question, and we have a whole bunch of really good answers. So we rewrote all the internals. And like that was one of the things that sucked because it's like you would have to wait. You know, if you had parent resolves in your parent, they would load, and then some other, you know, things would load in the child. Now we actually do like a fancy thing called a topological sort that allows you to construct a dependency graph of like the things that all of your resolves and your states and everything actually need. So it tries to load them as efficiently as possible. And there's like different policies that you can. I think you can define your own policies, but there's like 3 that are by default. I think, and the default one's eager, which does what I just said. And then there's another one that does the old style way. And then there's a third one. I don't remember what that does though, but yeah, now it's like super configurable. Any other questions? Yes. That's all right. Let's give somebody else a chance, and I'll come back to you. Yes.
So I think Angular 1.4 has a router that tracks, and are you
Well,
anybody plans to integrate with more Angular?
Angular 1.0 has had a router for a while now. Yeah, so Angular 1.4 has a backported router from Angular 2.0. It's taken Brian a little while to get there, and I kind of looked at it and I was like, wow, Brian, you implemented all of our best ideas from like a year ago. That's great. So yeah, I mean, it's definitely a step up from the router that was there before, but it's still kind of lacking by comparison. Now, once we kind of go post 1.0 and start rewriting everything in ES6 and transpile down, we'll probably be able to throw a bunch of stuff away because, like, yeah, they have an internal pipeline that's all promise-based too now, which is great. So yeah, we'll probably build more on internal Angular stuff. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, but you're going to keep it separate.
Yeah, so like a bunch of the stuff that really makes UI Router interesting is still like not in core. So like we're working on them with their design docs for the new router, and that's the kind of thing I was talking about at the beginning, where it's like, guys, you really need to use the state machine. And they're like, state machines are going to be too hard for people. It's just a state machine, man. Get over it. So yeah, like in my opinion, and I feel as though I am backed by science on this. States are kind of like a key abstraction when you're modeling out complex user interfaces, and whereas with the new router, it's still, you're just binding view configurations to URLs, and like that's a much more simplified, without trying to be insulting, I would say like naively simplified architecture. And you will find when you're doing large, complex applications that like you have to duplicate things in annoying ways, and a lot of things just start falling through the cracks. And then you have cool things like types and stuff like that too that they don't have a concept of, and like dynamic binding and all that stuff. So yeah, we're gonna keep chugging along. We'll probably be able to throw some code away, but not as much as we would like to, unfortunately. Yes. Anybody else? Hat Dude, you had one other question? No, that's cool.
Okay. Just where are the design docs?
The design docs for Angular 2?
Or stuff like with level sorting and default policies.
Oh, we don't do design docs. We're nowhere near that ambitious.
Okay.
I wish we were. That'd be great, but yeah. Okay. The code, I'll try and comment it a little more liberally. No, actually, well, okay. So these are the docs that are going to go out with the next version. That's legit. There's a lot of them. Sometimes. Yeah. So I'm gonna keep working on the docs, but
Is there anything good in the tests?
anything good in the tests? Yeah. I mean, the tests, like, there's a lot of them, and they read pretty straightforwardly. Yeah, check that out. It's good. Well played, Jeff. It's good. Good thought. Yeah. Any other questions? I hear there's karaoke after this.
Is this the end or?
Well, it's the question slide. The only thing after the question slide is the thank you and contact.
You already did that part.
I know, but I like to reiterate. I'm a super thankful person. Yes.
Well, how crazy do you want to go with nested views? Like, for example, if I had a view with just like a div in each one and a span, does it make sense making that a separate view at the top and then a UI view just because I don't want to repeat myself?
Well, how crazy do you want to go with nested views? No, it really comes down to like if it's like a separate piece of functionality that you would write a separate controller for. That's kind of like, and again, it's really a stylistic thing, like whatever works for you.
Well, like from a layout perspective.
from a layout perspective, if it's things that live together and move around together, then it's a view. And if it's like substantially different from something next to it that changes on its own and has its own controller, and you would conceivably want to have a state where the things there are different, then it's a view. Does that sort of answer your question?
Well, yeah, just the way I did it, like my indexation of just one UI view, and then my root is like another file which has like 3 separate UI views, and then I keep going down to the point where like I'm using the bootstrap panel. That's a view within itself. Like I'm trying to just not repeat myself, but I have like many pages which kind of follow the same outline, but the inner functionality.
You have a lot of MVC in there, it sounds like.
Yeah, I'm trying to like make it as modular as possible.
That's like super MVC right in there. Yeah, I don't know. The point at which modularity becomes annoying, that's kind of like the breaking point for me. So that's where I start putting things back together. So either you have a really high tolerance for annoying things, or you're doing it just fine.
Well, actually, but as far as like the parent statements, I remember on the GitHub there, right? Like the importance of having a template displaying UI view.
Oh.
Because I ended up with just like looking through my source, I just have like a bunch of empty nested UI views. But at that point, should I reference them as a parent? But then I stick my view into like a much higher.
Yeah, I mean, like I wouldn't go so far as like full empty page, you know, UI view tag, and that's it. I usually do, you know, like a header and a sidebar, and like that's maybe my root state. But I mean, what you can do there is, if you still want to wrap that stuff in a state, like you can have a UI view and have like your header, and sidebar and whatever else HTML just in it. So, and like you don't have to have a template. Like you can just, you know, have some default markup. Does that make sense?
No, it does.
Okay. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. That's what I've been doing.
Okay.
I've just been kind of using the hierarchy of results and data to like organize things.
Yeah.
More so that like at certain points, it seems like there's no point in binding to the parent view when in reality the layout is like 5 states.
Oh yeah, I mean if you're doing a lot of binding to parent stuff, like parent scope stuff or parent state stuff. Okay.
Like resolves or data.
Yeah, I mean, if you're doing a lot of binding to, or just like injecting parent resolves into, that's maybe a smell where you might want to consider either moving the logic into the resolve itself, or like moving some controller code higher. Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, like that's the kind of thing where it's hard to give general advice. Like I'd have to look at the code.
Everything's working as I want. I'm just trying to figure it out.
Yeah. Yeah, I hear that. Yeah, I can take a look after if you want. All right, cool. Yes.
Under what you mentioned before being able to have multiple controllers defined in one state.
Yeah.
Under what circumstances would you do that?
Basically, if you have like two things that are together, like let's say you have a view and then some like controls that affect that view, and like you want to have separate controllers that like derive that stuff, but then you want to either have them like talk to each other or you want to manage them as one thing, then you would do them as one state. Does that make sense? Yeah, and then you had a question?
I was just going to ask, if you're going down that route of like multiple layers of nesting, is there a lot of performance overhead for breaking it up in that way, or?
Not really. I mean, the only, like, I haven't really benchmarked the crap out of it, so intuitively my suggestion would be that like it's about the same as, you know, having a directive with a template, right?
Gotcha.
Now, if you're like pre-compiling everything so that, you know, you have all your templates squished into like a thing that gets stuck in your JavaScript at runtime, or, you know, at compile time, I would say the overhead is probably pretty negligible.
Gotcha. And the resolves, you said they
In the older version, it's like synchronous.
Yeah, kind of.
Gotcha.
It's not strictly synchronous. It's weird. It's sort of like you have these racing promises, but it's not. The load order is not totally optimal, but it is now. So.
Cool.
Yeah.
Backwards compatibility with the old version.
Backwards compatibility. That is an excellent question. For the most part, the only thing.
To tell you.
For the most part, the only thing I think of that like breaks really badly is all of the event hooks. So instead of taking like 5 billion parameters, you just have the transition object, which has all of your stuff. So, like for the most part, you can kind of search and replace on that. Yeah, that's probably about it. Everything else is fairly backwards compatible. Yeah. Should we all go drink beer now? All right.
Thank you.